My husband was buried on a Thursday. The roses were still fresh when people began talking about inheritance. Not openly. Not yet. But I could see it in the way conversations changed when I entered the room. The way people lowered their voices. The way they suddenly smiled too quickly. The way they stopped mentioning Charles altogether. As if grief had an expiration date. As if 6 weeks were enough to erase 42 years of marriage. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I am 71 years old. And 6 weeks after I buried my husband, my own son tried to take everything he left behind. Not because he needed the money. Not because he was struggling. But because someone convinced him that the legacy belonged to him now. The worst part? I didn't see it coming. Not from him. Never from Grant. The morning it happened started like any other. I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. Painfully quiet. For 42 years, Charles had been the first sound I heard every morning. The creak of the floorboards. The clink of a coffee cup. The soft clearing of his throat while reading the newspaper. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind you barely notice until they're gone forever. Now the silence felt enormous. Like the house itself was grieving. I stood at the kitchen window and looked across the gardens Charles had spent 20 years building. Every tree had a story. Every stone pathway had a purpose. He used to joke that the gardens would outlive both of us. Standing there alone, I realized he was right. The gardens remained. And I was the one left behind. Around 9 o'clock, Grant arrived. Not unusual. He had been visiting more often since the funeral. At least that's what I told myself. I thought he was worried about me. I thought he was trying to help. Now I understand something painful. Sometimes people come closer not because they care, but because they want something. Grant walked through the front door without knocking. Behind him was his wife, Brooke. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. Perfect timing. Always perfect timing. "Morning, Mom." He kissed my cheek. Brooke offered a polite smile. The kind that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, Eleanor." I remember thinking she looked unusually pleased about something. At the time I ignored the feeling. I wish I hadn't. We sat in the dining room. The same room where Charles had hosted charity dinners. Board meetings. Family Christmases. Birthdays. A lifetime of memories. Grant cleared his throat. Then he looked at Brooke. Brooke looked back at him. A silent exchange. A rehearsed exchange. The kind couples have when they've already discussed everything beforehand. My stomach tightened. For the first time that morning, something felt wrong. Very wrong. "Mom," Grant began. "We need to talk about the future." The future. I noticed he didn't say asterisk your future. Asterisk or asterisk our future. Asterisk just the future. As if I were no longer part of it. I folded my hands in my lap. "What about it?" Grant exhaled. Brooke stepped in immediately. Like she had been waiting. "We've been discussing what's best for everyone." There it was. One sentence. One harmless-looking sentence. And every older person knows exactly what it means. When someone says they're doing what's best for you, they're usually doing what's best for themselves. I felt my chest tighten. "What exactly are you discussing?" Grant shifted uncomfortably. Brooke didn't. She never did. "The house is very large, Eleanor." I looked around the room. "This house has been my home for 42 years. "Of course," Brooke said quickly. "But that's exactly the point." I already hated where this conversation was going. Grant finally spoke. "Mom, maybe it's time to consider something smaller." The room went silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to stop ticking. Smaller. Such a simple word. Such a cruel word. Because it wasn't about the house. It was about shrinking my life. Reducing it. Making room for someone else's plans. I stared at my son. "You're asking me to move." Grant rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not like that." "It sounds exactly like that." Brooke leaned forward. "We're only concerned about your well-being." There it was again. Concern. Always concern. Manipulation wears many disguises. Concern is one of the most effective. I looked directly at Grant. "Did your father ask for this?" His eyes dropped immediately. That was my answer. Charles would never have asked me to leave. Not while I was alive. Not while I still called this place home. Not while I still carried half the memories inside these walls. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence I still hear when I can't sleep. Grant looked up and said, "This house isn't really yours anymore, Mom." Silence. Pure silence. I felt as though all the air had vanished from the room. I couldn't even speak. I just stared at him, certain I had heard wrong. Certain my own son could not have said something so heartless. But he had. Brooke remained silent, because she didn't need to speak. The damage had already been done. Grant continued. The estate needs structure. The foundation needs leadership. Dad spent his entire life building something important. I listened, stunned. Then came the final blow. The sentence that revealed what this was really about. Dad built everything. He paused, then added quietly, "You were just part of it." For a moment, I thought my heart had stopped. 42 years. 42 years beside Charles, helping him build every company, every fundraiser, every scholarship program, every charitable initiative. I had sat through meetings, hosted events, managed crises, supported dreams, held the family together. And now my son was reducing my entire life to a footnote. You were just part of it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to remind him who stayed awake when he had pneumonia at age 7, who drove him to college, who sat in hospital waiting rooms, who attended every graduation, every birthday, every milestone. But grief teaches strange lessons. One of them is this: the people who hurt you most rarely listen to your pain. So I said nothing. Instead I stood, slowly, carefully, and walked toward the hallway. Grant called after me, "Mom." I didn't stop. Brooke called my name. I didn't stop. Because suddenly I understood something neither of them realized. They believed this conversation was over. They believed they had already won. But Charles Whitaker was many things. A businessman, a philanthropist, a husband, a father. And one thing he never was naive. If my husband had seen what was happening, if he had suspected even a fraction of this betrayal, then somewhere, somehow, he had prepared for it. I didn't know where. I didn't know how. But deep inside, for the first time since the funeral, I felt something unexpected. Not grief, not anger, not fear, hope. And before the week was over, I would discover a small walnut box hidden inside Charles's study. A box that would change everything. For the next 3 days I barely slept. Not because I was angry. Anger fades. What stayed with me was disbelief. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. Again, and again, and again. Every word, every pause, every glance between Grant and Brooke. The more I thought about it, the less it felt spontaneous. This wasn't a difficult conversation that had gone wrong. This was a decision, a plan, a conclusion they had reached long before they sat across from me in the dining room. And somehow, I had been the last person to know. The following Monday I found movers outside my house. Not scheduled movers. Not movers hired by me. Movers hired by someone else. 3 men stood beside a truck parked near the driveway. One of them carried a clipboard. Another was measuring furniture through the front windows. I froze. For several seconds I simply stared, certain there had to be some mistake. Then I saw Brooke, standing beside the truck, smiling, talking into her phone, pointing toward the house. My house. The same house Charles and I had built together. The same house where Grant took his first steps. The same house where every Christmas dinner had been held for 40 years. And Brooke was discussing it like a property listing. Like an asset. Like an opportunity. Not a home. She noticed me standing at the front door. For a split second, surprise crossed her face. Then the smile returned. Professional. Controlled. Practiced. "Eleanor." She walked toward me. "We weren't expecting you outside." I looked past her. "Why are there movers here?" Her answer came too quickly. "We're just exploring options." Exploring options. Another harmless phrase. Another lie dressed in polite language. I looked at the clipboard. One page caught my eye. At the top was a company logo. Underneath were several words highlighted in yellow. Estate transition plan. I felt something cold move through my chest. Estate transition. They weren't discussing possibilities anymore. They were making preparations. You've already decided. Brooke folded her arms. We're being proactive. No. I shook my head. You've already decided. For the first time. Her smile disappeared. Only for a moment. But it disappeared. And that was enough. Because beneath all the politeness, I finally saw the truth. She wasn't helping my son. She was directing him. That night I walked into Charles's study. A room I had avoided since the funeral. The smell still lingered. Leather. Old books. Coffee. The faint scent of cedar from his desk. For 6 weeks I couldn't bring myself to enter. The grief was too heavy. But now something else was stronger. Questions. Charles had always been meticulous. Every file labeled. Every document organized. Every important decision recorded somewhere. He believed preparation was an act of love. People only call it paranoia when nothing goes wrong, he used to joke. But preparation saves families. At the time I laughed. Now those words echoed differently. I sat in his chair. The chair no one else ever used. The chair that suddenly felt far too large. On the desk sat a framed photograph. Our wedding day. 42 years earlier. Charles looked impossibly young. So did I. I touched the frame. And for the first time since the funeral, I spoke to him. Out loud. I think something's wrong. The room remained silent. Of course it did. But speaking the words somehow made them real. I think they were waiting. My voice cracked. I think they were waiting for you to die. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then something caught my attention. A small brass key taped beneath the photograph. I frowned. Charles hated random things. Everything had a purpose. Everything. Why would a key be hidden beneath a wedding picture? I pulled the frame closer. There was a note. Tiny. Almost invisible. Written in Charles's handwriting. My heart stopped. It read, asterisk, if you're reading this, trust yourself. Asterisk. I stared at those words for nearly a minute. Trust yourself. Not trust Grant. Not trust the lawyers. Not trust the advisors. Trust yourself. Suddenly I remembered something. Years ago, Charles had installed a hidden compartment behind one of the bookshelves. Not for valuables. For documents. Important things shouldn't be obvious, he once said. At the time I rolled my eyes. Now I stood immediately. The bookshelf occupied the entire western wall. Hundreds of books. History. Business. Philosophy. Biographies. Most untouched for years. I ran my fingers along the wood. Searching. Waiting. Then I found it. A tiny indentation near the lower shelf. I pressed. Click. A section of shelving shifted outward. My breath caught. The compartment was still there. And inside was a small walnut box. The box was beautiful. Handcrafted. Dark polished wood. The kind Charles always admired. The kind he rarely bought for himself. Because he preferred spending money on everyone else. My hands trembled. Not from fear. From anticipation. Something inside me already knew. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't forgotten paperwork. Charles had left this for a reason. For me. The brass key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. And suddenly, everything changed. Inside the box were 3 items. A sealed envelope. A flash drive. And a leather journal. Nothing more. Nothing less. Yet somehow they felt heavier than anything I had ever held. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Addressed to me. My vision blurred before I finished reading the first line. My dearest Eleanor. If you're reading this, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared they might. I stopped breathing. Charles knew. Not everything. Not the details. But enough. Enough to leave a contingency. Enough to prepare. Enough to protect. I continued reading. For months I observed conversations that troubled me. Conversations about succession. Control. Influence. And entitlement. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong. But hope is not a strategy. That sounded exactly like Charles. Practical. Calm. Always practical. If someone attempts to separate you from your rightful place in this family, follow the instructions contained in this box. Trust no verbal assurances. Trust documents. Trust evidence. Trust actions. I felt tears running down my face. Not because I was sad, because for the first time in weeks, I no longer felt alone. Charles had seen something. Something important. Something dangerous. And he had prepared accordingly. I reached for the journal. The first page contained a single sentence. A sentence that made my blood run cold. The greatest threat to a legacy is not greed. It is entitlement disguised as responsibility. Then came names, dates, meeting notes, observations, private concerns, records, patterns, evidence, months of evidence, Grant, Brooke, board members, financial advisors, conversations, recommendations, proposals, everything documented, everything organized, everything undeniable. The deeper I read, the worse it became, because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't grief. This wasn't poor judgment. This had been developing long before Charles died, long before the funeral, long before anyone said a word to me. And then I reached the final page, the final instruction, the sentence that would launch the next chapter of this battle. When they believe they have already won, open the trust file. Below those words was a name, a law firm, a specific attorney, and an appointment date already scheduled, 2 weeks away. I stared at the page, then at the walnut box, then at my husband's handwriting. And for the first time since Grant told me the house no longer belonged to me, I smiled. A small smile, but a real one, because somewhere ahead, the truth was waiting, and the people trying to erase me had absolutely no idea what Charles Whitaker had left behind. For the next 2 weeks, I told no one about the walnut box. Not Grant, not Brooke, not even my closest friends. I followed Charles's instructions exactly, because one thing had become painfully clear. The people trying to remove me from my own life believed I was vulnerable. They believed grief had made me weak. They believed loneliness had made me dependent. And most importantly, they believed I knew nothing. Sometimes the most powerful position in the world is being underestimated. Grant called almost every day. His tone had changed. Subtly, but enough for me to notice. He no longer asked how I was feeling. He no longer asked whether I was sleeping. He no longer asked whether I needed anything. Instead, every conversation revolved around logistics, paperwork, property, administration, transition. Always transition. Have you thought any more about downsizing? Have you considered assisted living communities? The house is becoming difficult to maintain. The foundation needs stability. The board wants clarity. The board, the foundation, the estate. Everyone seemed to have needs. Everyone except me. One afternoon, Grant arrived alone. That surprised me. Brooke usually accompanied him everywhere, like a campaign manager following a politician. He sat across from me in the living room, looking tired, distracted, almost nervous. For a moment I saw the little boy he used to be. The child who once ran through these hallways carrying toy airplanes. The teenager who cried when his first dog died. The young man who called me every Sunday from college. That version of Grant still existed somewhere. Buried beneath ambition. Buried beneath influence. Buried beneath Brooke. Mom. His voice was unusually soft. I know things have been difficult. I said nothing. He leaned forward. We just want what's best. There was that phrase again. The phrase that always arrived moments before someone attempted to take something. Who is we? I asked. His expression tightened. What do you mean? I mean, every time you say we, it sounds less like my son speaking and more like someone reading from a script. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked away. And in that moment, I knew. Not because he confessed. Because he couldn't meet my eyes. The conversation ended shortly afterward. But one thing stayed with me. Grant wasn't leading this. He was participating. There is a difference. A dangerous difference. 3 days later, I attended my appointment with Charles's attorney. His name was Martin Keegan, a man Charles had trusted for nearly 30 years. Martin greeted me personally, not professionally, personally, as though he'd been expecting this day for a very long time. When we sat down, he looked at me carefully. Then he asked a question. A strange question. A question I wasn't expecting. Did Charles leave you a walnut box? My heart nearly stopped. I nodded. Martin leaned back and sighed. Not with surprise. With relief. Then he was right. About what? About everything. The room suddenly felt smaller. Martin opened a secure folder. Then another. Then another. By the time he finished, dozens of documents covered the conference table. What you're about to see, he said quietly, was never meant to be necessary. I stared at him. But Charles believed there was a possibility that certain people would mistake access for ownership. Access for ownership. I immediately thought of Brooke. Then Martin handed me a printed stack of emails. Read these. The first email was harmless. A discussion about foundation operations. The second discussed succession planning. The changed everything. It had been sent 18 months before Charles died. 18 months. The sender was Brooke. The recipient was a private financial consultant. I began reading. Grant needs to become the visible leader before Charles passes. Public perception matters. The transition must appear natural. I felt my stomach tighten. The next email was worse. Eleanor has emotional influence over Charles. Once she is removed from daily operations, decision-making will become significantly easier. Removed. Not included. Not respected. Removed. Like an obstacle. Like a problem. Like furniture. I turned another page. Then another. And another. The deeper I went, the uglier it became. Meeting notes. Strategy discussions. Private recommendations. Future planning. All centered around one assumption. One dangerous assumption. That Charles would eventually die. And that once he did, everything would belong to them. I looked up from the papers. Grant knew. Martin hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than any answer. Finally he nodded. Slowly. Not at first. I closed my eyes. Then later. Another pause. Later. Yes. For a moment I couldn't speak. Because betrayal from strangers is painful. Betrayal from family is something else entirely. It's grief. A second grief. A different grief. The grief of realizing someone you love is no longer who you believed they were. Martin slid another folder toward me. There's more. Inside were internal foundation records, board recommendations, private memorandums, planning documents. Then I found something that made my hands shake. A proposed rebranding strategy. I stared at the page, unable to believe it. Charles wasn't even gone yet when the proposal was drafted. His name was already being reduced, repositioned, restructured, repackaged. Not as a husband, not as a father, not as a founder, as a stepping stone. And suddenly I understood exactly what Brooke wanted. Not money. Money was already available. Not comfort. She already had comfort. She wanted control, influence, recognition, status. She didn't want to inherit Charles's legacy. She wanted to become it. Martin opened one final folder. This is the part Charles hoped you'd never need. Inside was a schedule. An event schedule. A gala. A major gala. Hosted by Brooke. Hosted by Grant. Hosted in my home. 6 weeks from now. The event title sat at the top of the page. Large. Bold. Impossible to ignore. My blood ran cold. Because nowhere on the invitation, nowhere on the guest list, nowhere in the program, was my name. Not once. I looked up slowly. Am I invited? Martin didn't answer. He didn't need to. And in that moment, I realized something. The event wasn't a celebration. It was a coronation. Grant and Brooke weren't waiting for ownership anymore. They were preparing to announce it. Publicly. Permanently. They thought the story was over. They thought I had already been erased. But they were wrong. Terribly wrong. Because 6 weeks from now, at that gala, in front of every donor, every board member, every journalist, and every influential guest, the truth would finally be revealed. And when it happened, the entire room would learn the same lesson. A legacy is not inherited through entitlement. It is earned through character. 6 weeks later, the invitations went out. Cream-colored cardstock. Embossed lettering. Gold trim. Expensive. Elegant. Calculated. Everything Brooke touched was calculated. The event was being marketed as a celebration. A celebration of Charles Whitaker's vision. A celebration of the future. A celebration of leadership. At least, that's what the invitations claimed. But after reading the documents Martin had shown me, I knew what it really was. It wasn't a celebration. It was a takeover. The venue wasn't a hotel. It wasn't a conference center. It wasn't a banquet hall. It was my home. My home. The house Grant wanted me to leave. The house Brooke had already started treating like her own. The house Charles and I had spent 4 decades building together. And now they planned to fill it with donors, board members, reporters, and investors. Not to honor Charles. To replace him. 3 days before the event, I drove past the property. I hadn't been there since discovering the truth. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Workers were unloading decorations. Event planners moved through the gardens. Lighting crews installed equipment near the fountain. Valet signs lined the driveway. Everything looked beautiful, and that somehow made it worse. Then I saw the banner. A massive banner hanging near the entrance. No mention of Charles. No mention of Eleanor. Only the future. Their future. I sat in my car and stared at it. For a long time. Long enough for anger to arrive. Then pass. Long enough for sadness to arrive. Then pass. Eventually only clarity remained. Because something finally became obvious. This event wasn't being organized for donors. It wasn't being organized for charity. It wasn't even being organized for business. It was being organized for appearances. Brooke wanted witnesses. She wanted influential people to see Grant standing at the center of the room. She wanted photographs, headlines, recognition, validation. She wanted everyone to believe the transition was complete. There was only one problem. The transition wasn't complete. Not even close. The next morning, Martin called. There's been a development. What kind of development? A significant one. His tone made me sit up immediately. What happened? Martin sighed. Someone on the board forwarded us additional correspondence. My stomach tightened. More emails. More than emails. An hour later, I was sitting in his office again. The folder waiting on the table was thicker than the last one. Much thicker. Inside were internal communications from the previous year. Messages. Meeting summaries. Private recommendations. And one document that changed everything. Occupancy plan. I opened it. And immediately felt sick. The document outlined renovations. Furniture changes. Office conversions. Guest accommodations. For my house. Not after I moved. After I was removed. The language was cold. Corporate. Efficient. Asterisk primary suite reassigned. Asterisk asterisk personal items archived. Asterisk asterisk legacy office redesigned. Asterisk asterisk residential optimization phase. Asterisk residential optimization. That was how they described my life. 42 years of memories reduced to a project schedule. Then I reached the final page. And there it was. The sentence that made everything personal. Asterisk current occupant unlikely to remain indefinitely. Asterisk current occupant. Not Eleanor. Not Mrs. Whitaker. Not Charles's widow. Current occupant. Like I was a tenant. Like I was temporary. Like I was already gone. I slowly closed the folder. Who wrote this? Martin met my eyes. Brooke. The room became very quiet. For weeks, I had told myself that maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe grief had clouded judgment. Maybe ambition had gone too far. Maybe people had made mistakes. That illusion finally died. This wasn't confusion. This was strategy. And Brooke had been planning it for over a year. Then Martin slid another document across the table. This one matters even more. I looked down. It was a speech. Grant's speech. The speech he intended to deliver at the gala. I began reading. The opening paragraphs were harmless. Thanking donors. Thanking supporters. Recognizing the foundation. Then came a section that made my chest tighten. Asterisk, my father built this organization through vision and leadership. Asterisk, nothing wrong with that. Then, Asterisk, the next chapter requires fresh direction. Asterisk, still acceptable. Then, asterisk, the previous generation made valuable contributions. Asterisk, previous generation. Contributions. Not founders. Not builders. Contributions. I kept reading. Asterisk, the future belongs to those prepared to lead it. Asterisk, that was the moment I understood. Grant wasn't merely participating anymore. He believed it. He actually believed he had earned the throne. Not because he built something. Because he inherited proximity to someone who did. And that is one of the most dangerous delusions a person can develop. Confusing inheritance with achievement. Confusing access with merit. Confusing entitlement with leadership. I folded the speech and placed it back on the table. For several seconds, neither Martin nor I spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. Are you ready? I looked at him. Ready for what? His expression remained calm. For the truth. The truth. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Not punishment. Truth. Because once the trust documents were revealed, everything would change. The board would learn the truth. The donors would learn the truth. The press would learn the truth. Grant would learn the truth. Brooke would learn the truth. And perhaps most importantly, I would finally learn exactly how much Charles knew. Martin handed me one final envelope. This stays sealed until the gala. I examined it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charles. My hands trembled. What's inside? Martin smiled slightly. The reason your husband was 3 moves ahead of everyone else. For the first time in weeks. I laughed. A small laugh, but a real one. Because somewhere inside that envelope, inside those trust documents, inside the plans Charles left behind, was a surprise neither Brooke nor Grant saw coming. And 3 nights later, when every important person in the Whitaker Foundation gathered under one roof, that surprise would be revealed in front of all of them, publicly, irreversibly, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, the kind of evening Charles always loved. No clouds, no wind, just a sky full of stars above the gardens he spent 20 years creating. From a distance the house looked beautiful, every window glowing, every pathway illuminated, every flower bed perfectly maintained. Guests would call it elegant. Donors would call it impressive. Reporters would call it historic. But standing there in the darkness I saw something else. A battlefield. Cars began arriving before sunset. Luxury sedans. Black SUVs. Valets moved quickly. Photographers positioned themselves near the entrance. Board members stepped out smiling. Donors greeted one another. Everyone seemed excited. Everyone seemed optimistic. Everyone seemed convinced they were attending the beginning of something. None of them realized they were about to witness an ending. Inside, Brooke moved through the crowd like a queen hosting a coronation. Every detail reflected her influence. Every arrangement reflected her vision. Every conversation somehow returned to the future. Always the future. Never the past. Never Charles. Never sacrifice. Never loyalty. Only opportunity. She wore a dark blue gown. Expensive. Elegant. Perfectly chosen. Not because she wanted attention. Because she expected authority. There is a difference. And Brooke understood that difference better than most people. Grant stood near the center of the room, shaking hands, smiling for photographs, accepting congratulations that had not yet been earned. At one point a donor clapped him on the shoulder. Your father would be proud. Grant smiled, then replied, We're taking things in a new direction. The donor nodded, impressed. I felt something break inside me, not from anger, from disappointment, because Charles had spent his entire life teaching Grant that leadership begins with gratitude, not replacement, not ego, not ownership, gratitude. And yet here he was, standing beneath his father's roof, preparing to inherit applause he had not earned. At 7 o'clock sharp I arrived, not through the back entrance, not quietly, not secretly, through the front door. The moment I entered, conversations stopped, one by one, like falling dominoes. People noticed, then whispered, then stared. Some looked relieved. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked guilty. Brooke was the first to see me. The smile vanished from her face instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough. The kind of reaction a person has when an unexpected variable enters a carefully planned equation. Grant turned. His expression froze. For several seconds neither of them moved. Then Brooke recovered. As she always did. "Eleanor." Her voice sounded pleasant. "Almost warm you came." I smiled. "Of course." A long silence followed. Then I glanced around the room. "After all." I paused. "This is my home." Several guests exchanged nervous looks. Brooke's jaw tightened. Only slightly. But I noticed. Because tonight I noticed everything. The next hour passed slowly. I spoke with donors. Old friends. Former board members. People who remembered Charles. People who remembered the early years. The difficult years. The years before success. And something interesting happened. The more people spoke, the clearer the truth became. Most of them had no idea what Brooke and Grant were planning. Most believed this event was simply a celebration. Most believed I was still deeply involved. Most believed Charles's wishes were being honored. The deception wasn't just aimed at me. It was aimed at everyone. Around 8:30 the formal program began. Guests moved toward the ballroom. Champagne glasses disappeared. Conversations softened. Lights dimmed. At the front of the room stood a large stage. Behind it hung a giant projection screen. Across the screen appeared the words. Applause erupted. Grant stepped onto the stage. Confident. Relaxed. Prepared. He adjusted the microphone. Smiled. Then began speaking. My father dedicated his life to service. More applause. He built an organization that changed thousands of lives. Applause again. He believed leadership meant looking forward. I watched quietly. Waiting. Because I had already read the speech. I knew what was coming. Then he reached the section that mattered. The next chapter requires new vision. Several board members nodded. The future belongs to those prepared to lead it. More applause. Grant smiled. Encouraged. Confident. Certain. Then he said something that would haunt him for years. Every generation eventually steps aside. The room remained silent. Listening. And every generation must trust the next to carry the legacy forward. He glanced toward me. Just briefly. But everyone saw it. The implication hung in the air. Subtle. But unmistakable. Step aside. That was the message. Not only to me. To everyone. The transition was complete. Or so he believed. Then the ballroom doors opened. And Martin Keegan walked inside. The room shifted immediately. Several board members recognized him. So did the donors. So did Grant. And judging by Brooke's expression, so did she. Martin wasn't smiling. He wasn't carrying champagne. He wasn't attending as a guest. He was carrying a leather portfolio. The same portfolio Charles had used for years. The room grew quiet. Grant stopped speaking. For the first time all evening. He looked uncertain. Martin continued walking. Slowly. Calmly. Deliberately. Straight toward the stage. And at that moment, every instinct I possessed told me the same thing. The game was over. The truth had arrived. And in the next few minutes, everything Brooke and Grant had spent years building would begin to collapse. Martin stepped onto the stage. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. No one dared. Because everyone in that room knew exactly who he was. For nearly 30 years, Martin Keegan had been Charles Whitaker's attorney. Not his employee. Not his advisor. His trusted confidant. The man who knew where every document lived. The man who knew every agreement. Every trust. Every amendment. Every contingency plan. The room fell completely silent. Grant stood frozen behind the podium. Martin stopped a few feet away. Then looked directly at him. For several seconds neither man spoke. The tension was unbearable. Finally Martin broke the silence. Good evening. His voice was calm. Measured. Professional. I apologize for the interruption. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone waited. I am here because Charles Whitaker instructed me to be here. A ripple moved through the crowd. Grant's confidence visibly weakened. Brooke's face became expressionless. The kind of expression people wear when they are desperately trying not to panic. Martin opened the leather portfolio, then removed a sealed envelope. The same envelope Charles had prepared. The same envelope that had remained untouched until this evening. He held it up for everyone to see. This document contains instructions that were to be revealed only if certain conditions were met. The room became even quieter. If attempts were made to alter control of the Whitaker Foundation. Pause. If attempts were made to remove Eleanor Whitaker from her rightful role. Another pause. If any individual attempted to claim authority through assumption rather than qualification. Several board members exchanged glances. A few looked directly at Brooke. Martin carefully opened the envelope, then unfolded the letter inside. When he began reading, the room seemed to stop breathing. If you are hearing these words, then events have unfolded in a way I hoped would never occur. Charles's voice wasn't there. Yet somehow everyone could hear him. I built my life's work on a simple principle. Character before authority. Service before recognition. Responsibility before reward. Martin continued. A legacy is not inherited because someone desires it. It is entrusted to those who prove worthy of carrying it. Across the room, Brooke's hands tightened around her champagne glass. Grant stared straight ahead. Motionless. Martin turned to the next page. Then everything changed. After consultation with legal counsel and independent trustees, I have established a succession structure designed to protect the foundation from entitlement, manipulation, and conflicts of interest. A murmur spread through the audience. Several board members sat forward. Now they were listening very carefully. The Whitaker Foundation shall not pass automatically to any family member. The room exploded with whispers. Grant blinked. Once. Twice. As if he had heard incorrectly. Martin continued. No family member shall assume executive control without first satisfying all trust requirements outlined herein. The whispers grew louder. Brooke looked directly at Martin, then at Grant, then back at Martin. For the first time all evening, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Martin removed another document. This one thicker. Formal. Stamped. Signed. Legally binding. The trust established by Charles Whitaker contains specific performance conditions. Grant finally spoke. What conditions? His voice sounded smaller now. Martin looked at him, then answered. The conditions you failed. Silence. Absolute silence. The words landed like a hammer. Several guests actually gasped. Grant stared in disbelief. What are you talking about? Martin calmly opened the file. Within 90 days of Charles Whitaker's passing, all potential successors were required to demonstrate fiduciary integrity, ethical leadership, and continued support of existing governance structures. Grant shook his head. I don't understand. Martin's response came immediately. That is precisely the problem. More silence. Then Martin continued. The trust specifically prohibited attempts to isolate Eleanor Whitaker from Foundation affairs. Pause. The trust prohibited efforts to remove her from her residence. Pause. The trust prohibited unilateral succession planning. Pause. The trust prohibited coercive influence over board governance. Every sentence struck harder than the one before. Across the room, donors were now staring openly at Brooke. Others stared at Grant. Some looked horrified. Others looked embarrassed. Several looked angry. Martin lifted another document. These provisions were not theoretical. They were measurable. Documented. Trackable. He paused. Then added. And they were violated. The room erupted. Not loudly, but enough. Whispers. Shock. Disbelief. People turning toward one another. Questions. Confusion. Grant stepped away from the podium. His face had gone pale. Who says they were violated? Martin looked directly at him, then placed a stack of documents on the podium. Your emails. Pause. Your planning records. Pause. Your meeting notes. Pause. Your occupancy transition proposal. The blood drained from Brooke's face. She knew. The moment she heard those words, she knew. The evidence existed. All of it. Every message. Every strategy. Every private discussion. Nothing had disappeared. Nothing had remained hidden. Martin turned toward the audience, then spoke clearly. The Trust Review Committee completed its investigation 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Meaning the decision had already been made. Before tonight. Before the speeches. Before the celebration. Before the coronation. Everything had already been decided. Grant just didn't know it yet. Martin continued. The committee unanimously determined that Grant Whitaker does not currently qualify for succession authority. A donor in the front row slowly removed his glasses. Another lowered her head. One board member simply closed his eyes. Because everyone understood what had just happened. Grant hadn't inherited leadership. He had lost it. In front of everyone. Publicly. Irreversibly. And then came the final blow. The one Charles had saved for last. Martin unfolded a final page. Looked directly at the audience. And read. In the event these standards are violated, operational authority shall transfer immediately to Eleanor Whitaker as primary trustee and protector of the foundation. For a second nobody reacted. Then reality hit. Eleanor Whitaker. Not Grant. Not Brooke. Eleanor. The room erupted into stunned silence once again. The kind of silence that only appears when an entire room realizes they have misunderstood everything. And standing in the center of that silence, I finally understood exactly what my husband had done. He hadn't built a trap. He had built a test. And the people who believed they had already won had just failed it. Grant looked at me. Not at Martin. Not at the board. Not at the audience. At me. For the first time in months there was no confidence in his eyes. No certainty. No authority. Only confusion. And fear. Mom. His voice cracked. Just slightly. But everyone heard it. I didn't know. The words hung in the air. Nobody responded. Because it didn't matter. Not anymore. Whether he knew every detail or only half of them was irrelevant. The outcome remained the same. He had participated. He had signed documents. He had attended meetings. He had allowed himself to be used. And somewhere along the way he stopped asking whether something was right. And started asking whether it was possible. Those are very different questions. One builds character. The other destroys it. Martin remained standing. The trust committee has one final finding. Every head turned toward him. The committee determined that several governance recommendations submitted over the past 18 months were influenced by undisclosed personal interests. A wave of whispers moved through the room. Everyone knew who he meant. Martin didn't need to say her name. But he did anyway. Mrs. Brooke Whitaker. The room froze. Brooke's expression hardened instantly. I object. Her voice was sharp. Controlled. Dangerous. The voice of someone who realized the script had changed. Martin nodded politely. You are entitled to your opinion. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Brooke took a step forward. This is outrageous. No. Martin replied calmly. The documentation is quite thorough. Then he opened another folder. And suddenly Brooke stopped moving. Because she recognized it. The folder. The color. The label. She had seen it before. Somewhere. At some point. And now it was here. In front of everyone. Martin removed several printed pages. The committee reviewed correspondence recommending the removal of Eleanor Whitaker from foundation influence. Pause. Recommendations regarding residential reassignment. Pause. Recommendations regarding board restructuring. Another pause. And recommendations intended to consolidate authority. The audience was no longer whispering. Now they were simply staring. Watching. Listening. Waiting. Because everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't gossip. This was evidence. The kind evidence creates consequences. One board member slowly stood. Then another. Then another. Not leaving. Positioning themselves. Creating distance. Distance from Brooke. Distance from the decisions. Distance from the fallout. Brooke noticed. Of course she noticed. People like Brooke always notice when support begins to disappear. And support was disappearing rapidly. Grant looked toward her. Looking for answers. Looking for guidance. Looking for the person who always seemed to know what to do. But for the first time, she had nothing. Because manipulation works best in private. Truth works best in public. And tonight the truth had an audience. Martin continued. Effective immediately. All pending succession proposals are suspended. Pause. All governance changes are suspended. Pause. All residential transition actions are suspended. The audience absorbed every word. Then came the final ruling. Furthermore, the board has voted unanimously to initiate a full review of all strategic recommendations submitted by Brooke Whittaker over the previous 18 months. That was it. The moment everything collapsed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Slowly. Publicly. Completely. Because reputations are strange things. They take years to build. And sometimes only minutes to destroy. Brooke looked around the room. Searching. For allies. For supporters. For anyone willing to stand beside her. She found none. Not one. The donors looked away. The board members avoided eye contact. Even Grant remained silent. Standing alone beneath the stage lights. For the first time she understood what isolation felt like. The very thing she had planned for me. Now she was experiencing it herself. Martin closed the final folder. The meeting is concluded. No applause followed. No celebration. No speeches. No photographs. No triumphant ending. Only silence. And consequences. Then something unexpected happened. One of the oldest donors in the foundation slowly walked toward me. 80 years old. Silver hair. Supported by a cane. He stopped directly in front of me. And smiled. I knew Charles for 35 years. I smiled back. He nodded. Then said something I will never forget. We all thought he built buildings. Pause. He was actually building safeguards. Then he shook my hand. And walked away. One by one others followed. Board members. Donors. Community leaders. Friends. People who remembered the truth. People who remembered the beginning. People who remembered who had actually helped build the foundation. And for the first time since Charles died, I no longer felt invisible. I no longer felt erased. I no longer felt alone. Because the truth has a strange quality. It eventually finds daylight. No matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. Across the room, Grant remained standing near the stage. Watching. Silent. Lost. And when our eyes met one final time that evening, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Not arrogance. Not entitlement. Not ambition. Regret. Real regret. The kind that arrives too late. The kind that cannot be argued away. The kind that forces a person to confront themselves. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because losing power is one thing. Learning from it is another. And over the next 3 months, the Whittaker family would discover exactly how expensive entitlement can become. 3 months later, the house was quiet again. Not empty. Not lonely. Just quiet. The way it had been before ambition arrived and started calling itself leadership. Spring had begun to return. New flowers lined the gardens. The roses Charles planted years ago were blooming again. Life, as always, continued moving forward. Even when people wished it would stop. Even when hearts were broken. Even when families fell apart. Life moved forward anyway. And over those 3 months a great deal had changed. The Foundation's review committee completed its investigation. The results were not favorable. Not for Brooke. Not for the people who supported her plans. Not for anyone who believed influence could replace integrity. Several proposals were formally rejected. Governance reforms were reversed. New oversight procedures were established. Transparency requirements increased. The Foundation survived. Stronger than before. Because sometimes a crisis reveals weaknesses that would otherwise remain hidden. Brooke resigned before the final report was released. Officially, she cited personal reasons. Everyone knew the truth. She understood what was coming. And she wanted to leave before it arrived. Unfortunately for her, reputational damage rarely follows schedules. It arrives whenever it chooses. Several organizations quietly ended their relationships with her. Board invitations disappeared. Consulting opportunities vanished. Phone calls stopped. The people who once praised her leadership suddenly became difficult to reach. That is another lesson life teaches. Some people support power. Very few support accountability. A month later, Brooke moved out. Not only from the house she hoped to control. From Grant's life. Their separation wasn't dramatic. No public scandal. No shouting. No scenes. Just distance. Cold distance. The kind that develops when two people discover they were never building the same future. Brooke wanted influence. Grant wanted approval. And when both disappeared, so did the marriage. As for Grant, the transformation was harder. Because humiliation fades. Regret does not. The board removed him from all succession discussions. Not permanently, but indefinitely. Trust, they explained, must be rebuilt before responsibility can be restored. A painful lesson. A necessary one. For weeks he avoided public events. Avoided former colleagues. Avoided reporters. Avoided almost everyone. Including me. Especially me. Then one afternoon in early May, I found him standing at my front gate. Alone. No assistant. No lawyer. No broke. Just Grant. For several seconds neither of us moved. The distance between us felt enormous. Not because of the driveway. Because of everything that had happened. Finally he spoke. Mom. His voice sounded older. Not physically older. Emotionally older. As though the previous 3 months had aged him years. I nodded. Grant. He looked down. Then toward the gardens. Then back at me. Unable to find the right words. For the first time in his life, words failed him. Can we talk? I studied him carefully. The expensive confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. The entitlement was gone. All that remained was a man confronting the consequences of his choices. I opened the gate. And together we walked through the gardens. The same gardens Charles loved. The same gardens where Grant used to play as a child. The same gardens he almost lost without realizing it. For several minutes we said nothing. Sometimes silence accomplishes more than conversation. Eventually Grant stopped near the fountain. The fountain Charles installed on our 25th anniversary. I was wrong. There it was. Simple. Direct. No excuses. No qualifications. No explanations. Just truth. I remained silent, letting him continue. I kept telling myself I was helping. He swallowed hard. I told myself I was protecting the foundation. Pause. I told myself I was doing what Dad would have wanted. Another pause. But none of that was true. The words came slowly. Painfully. Honestly. I wanted recognition. His voice cracked. I wanted people to see me the way they saw him. For a moment I saw the little boy again. The little boy who spent his entire life trying to impress his father. Trying to earn approval. Trying to measure up to a man who seemed larger than life. The tragedy wasn't that Grant wanted to be respected. The tragedy was that he chose the wrong path to earn it. You know what I finally realized? He asked. I shook my head. I spent years trying to inherit Dad's legacy. He laughed bitterly. When I should have been trying to deserve it. The words hung between us. Heavy. True. Necessary. For the first time since Charles died, I felt something soften inside me. Not because the pain disappeared. Because understanding had finally arrived. Grant looked at me. Tears forming in his eyes. I'm sorry. No speech followed. No dramatic explanation. No defense. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. And strangely, those 2 words carried more weight than every speech he gave at the gala. Because humility is louder than confidence. When it's genuine. I reached into my purse. Then handed him a small envelope. His eyebrows lifted. What is this? A letter. He looked confused. From Dad. I nodded. Charles had left one final instruction. One final letter. One final safeguard. Not for the foundation. For his son. Grant opened it carefully. His hands trembling. As he read, tears began rolling down his face. I had read the letter only once. That was enough. I remembered every word. My son, if you are reading this, then life has taught you a lesson I could not. I hope it was not too painful. But if it was, learn from it. Authority does not make a leader. Titles do not make a leader. Inheritance does not make a leader. Character makes a leader. And character is earned when no one is watching. If you have lost something, rebuild. If you have failed, improve. If you have fallen, stand. That is what the Whitaker name was always meant to represent. Not success. Resilience. Grant lowered the letter. Unable to speak. For a long time we stood there together. Beside the fountain. Surrounded by the gardens. Surrounded by memories. Surrounded by the life Charles spent decades building. Finally, Grant asked a question. A simple question. Perhaps the most important one. What happens now? I smiled. The first genuine smile I had given him in months. Now. I looked around the gardens. At the flowers. The trees. The fountain. The house. The legacy. Now you start earning it. For the first time since arriving, Grant smiled too. A small smile. But a real one. And in that moment I realized something my husband understood long before the rest of us. A legacy is not money. It is not property. It is not influence. It is not control. A legacy is the values you leave behind. The standards you refuse to compromise. The character you build when life becomes difficult. My son thought inheritance meant ownership. My husband knew it meant responsibility. And perhaps that was the final lesson. Not only for Grant. For all of us. Because sooner or later every person faces the same choice. Will you spend your life trying to possess something? Or will you spend your life becoming worthy of it? Charles Whitaker left behind a foundation. A home. A family. A name. But the greatest thing he left behind was a lesson. One that none of us would ever forget. And as I stood in the garden watching another sunset settle across the roses he planted decades ago, I finally understood. The house was never the legacy. The money was never the legacy. The foundation was never the legacy. Character was. And character, unlike inheritance, must always be earned. The following autumn, the foundation held its annual gala. The same gala. The same donors. The same board members. The same mission. But everything felt different. Not because the organization had changed. Because the people inside it had. This time there were no banners about the future. No speeches about succession. No attempts to impress anyone. Just stories. Stories about students who received scholarships. Families who received support. Communities that benefited from the work. The kind of stories Charles always cared about. The kind that had been forgotten during the battle for control. I sat at a table near the back of the room. Exactly where I preferred to be. Never in the spotlight. Never at the center. That was always Charles's role. Not mine. Halfway through the evening, the chairman stepped onto the stage. He thanked the donors. Thanked the volunteers. Thanked the staff. Then he surprised everyone. We have one final recognition tonight. The room quieted. This recognition is not for a financial contribution. Pause. Not for leadership. Pause. Not for influence. A few people looked confused. The chairman smiled. It is for stewardship. Then he looked directly at me. And suddenly the room erupted into applause. I froze. Completely unprepared. People stood. One after another. Then more. Then the entire room. A standing ovation. Not for wealth. Not for power. Not for success. For staying. For protecting something worth protecting. I felt tears forming immediately. Because in that moment I wasn't thinking about the foundation. I was thinking about Charles. The man who believed character mattered. The man who saw danger before anyone else. The man who trusted me when others didn't. The applause continued. Longer than I expected. Longer than I deserved. And then something unexpected happened. Grant stood first. Not because people were watching. Not because cameras were recording. Not because he wanted credit. He stood because it was the right thing to do. And for the first time in a very long time, I saw Charles in him. Not the ambition. Not the confidence. Not the talent. The humility. The room eventually settled. The evening continued. The speeches resumed. The donors mingled. The music returned. But something important had happened. A chapter had closed. Not perfectly. Not magically. Not without scars. But honestly. And sometimes honesty is the closest thing life gives us to a happy ending. Months later, while sorting through some of Charles's old papers, I found a note tucked inside one of his favorite books. A note I had never seen before. A note he likely forgot was there. Or maybe he wanted me to find someday. With Charles, it was impossible to know. The paper was yellowed. The handwriting unmistakable. It contained only one sentence. If people fight over what I leave behind, then I failed to teach them what mattered. I sat there for a long time after reading it, because that sentence explained everything. The house, the trust, the foundation, the conflict, the heartbreak, the redemption, all of it. People spend their lives believing the most valuable things can be owned. Money, property, influence, status. But the things that truly matter work differently. Trust cannot be inherited. Respect cannot be inherited. Wisdom cannot be inherited. Character cannot be inherited. Each generation must build those things for itself. And maybe that's why Charles designed the trust the way he did. Not to punish anyone. Not to control anyone. Not to win from beyond the grave. But to teach one final lesson. A legacy isn't something you receive. It's something you prove worthy of carrying. Years from now, people may forget the controversy. They may forget the investigation. They may forget the speeches and the headlines. But I hope they remember the lesson. Because families break apart when entitlement replaces gratitude. Organizations fail when ambition replaces service. And people lose themselves when recognition becomes more important than integrity. The Whitaker family almost learned those lessons too late. Almost. Fortunately, almost was enough. And as the sun set beyond the gardens one final time that evening, I looked across the roses Charles planted decades ago and smiled. Not because everything had been restored. Not because life had become perfect. But because the most important thing survived. The truth. And in the end, the truth protected the legacy far better than any inheritance ever could.